Imagine standing on a beach fortification on a Pacific island in 1945, watching the horizon as the American invasion fleet approaches. You've already endured days of bombardment from battleships and cruisers, their massive shells demolishing concrete bunkers and turning the landscape into a cratered moonscape. You've survived air attacks that came in waves, dropping bombs and napalm, until the sky itself seemed to be on fire. Your position is damaged, but intact. Your gun is still functional, and you're prepared to fight to the death when the Marines come ashore. Then, just as the first landing craft begin their run toward the beach, you notice smaller vessels moving forward from the fleet, strange-looking ships, barely bigger than landing craft themselves, coming closer to shore than any warship should dare. They anchor perhaps 1,000 yards from your position, close enough that you can see individual sailors moving on their decks. For a moment, nothing happens. Then these small ships transform into volcanoes of fire, launching not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of rockets in a matter of minutes, turning the entire beach into an inferno of explosions that makes everything that came before seem like a prelude. This is your introduction to the LSM-R, the rocket barge that nobody talks about, but that everyone who experienced it never forgot. The landing ship, medium rocket, designated LSM-R in Navy nomenclature, was one of the Pacific War's most specialized and terrifying weapons, a ship that existed for one purpose: to deliver overwhelming volumes of rocket fire onto enemy beaches in the final minutes before Marines and soldiers hit the sand. These weren't impressive vessels by traditional naval standards. They were 203 feet long, displaced barely 1,000 tons, and looked like oversized landing craft because that's essentially what they were. The LSMR was a conversion of the standard LSM, a landing craft designed to carry tanks and vehicles directly onto beaches. But instead of a cargo hold full of vehicles, the rocket version carried over 100 launch tubes and thousands of rockets, transforming a humble amphibious vessel into a floating artillery battery that could unleash more firepower in 10 minutes than an entire battalion of field guns could fire in an hour. To understand why the Navy developed such an unusual weapon, you need to understand the fire support problem that amphibious operations presented. By 1944, the Pacific Island Campaign had established a predictable pattern. American forces would assault a heavily fortified island, requiring massive fire support to suppress Japanese defenses long enough for troops to get ashore and establish a beachhead. The fire support came in layers, each one designed to address specific threats at specific ranges and times. Heavy cruisers and battleships would bombard the island for days before the landing, destroying major fortifications, ammunition dumps, and command posts with their large-caliber guns. Carrier aircraft would attack using bombs and rockets against targets that naval guns couldn't reach or identify. On the morning of the landing, destroyers would move closer to shore, engaging targets with their 5-inch guns in the hours before the assault waves launched. But there was a critical gap in this fire support ladder, a window of vulnerability that occurred in the final minutes before troops hit the beach. At some point, the big ships had to stop firing to avoid hitting the landing craft carrying the assault troops. The planes had to break off their attacks for the same reason. But in those final minutes, the time when landing craft were most vulnerable, when they were committed to their approach and couldn't turn back when Japanese defenders were emerging from their shelters to man weapons that would slaughter Marines in their boats, there was no effective fire support that could continue safely. Artillery firing from ships offshore couldn't distinguish friend from foe at close range. Naval guns had to cease fire when friendly troops got too close. What was needed was a weapon that could deliver massive, indiscriminate firepower onto beach defenses in the final moments before the landing, something that could saturate an entire beach area with explosions suppressing or destroying anything that might threaten the assault waves. The solution was rockets. Rockets had been used for naval bombardment before, most notably by the British in Europe, but they were inaccurate and relatively light compared to naval gunfire. What made them valuable wasn't precision. They couldn't hit specific targets reliably, but volume. A rocket launcher could fire dozens or hundreds of projectiles in rapid succession, blanketing an area with explosions rather than precisely destroying individual targets. For the final minutes of a beach assault, when the goal was simply to keep Japanese defenders' heads down and destroy any weapons or troops exposed on the beach, volume mattered more than accuracy. If you could turn the entire landing zone into a storm of explosions, it didn't matter if individual rockets missed their targets, because there would be so many rockets that nothing could survive in the impact area. The LSM-R was designed around this concept. The Navy took the basic LSM hull, which was already designed to approach close to shore and had good seakeeping for its size, and converted it into a rocket platform. The standard configuration for the LSM-R class included 10 automatic 5-inch rocket launchers, each capable of firing rockets in rapid automatic sequence, plus additional manual launchers that could be loaded and fired by hand. The automatic launchers used the Mark 51 rocket system, firing 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets that weighed about 40 pounds each and carried a high explosive warhead. These weren't sophisticated weapons. The rockets were essentially tubes full of explosives, with solid rocket motors stabilized by spin rather than fins, and aimed by pointing the entire launcher in the general direction of the target. Accuracy was terrible. By artillery standards, a rocket might land anywhere within 100 yards of its aim point. But when you were firing 1,000 rockets at a beach, accuracy became less important than saturation. The sheer volume of fire these small ships could deliver was staggering. A single LSM-R could carry over 1,000 rockets and fire them in as little as 10 minutes, though more typically the barrage would be spread over 20 to 30 minutes to allow for reloading the automatic launchers and firing the manual racks. Do the math: 1,000 40-pound high explosive warheads landing on a beach area, perhaps 1,000 yards wide by a few hundred yards deep, meant explosions occurring literally every few yards across the entire landing zone. Nothing exposed could survive. Troops in open positions would be killed. Machine gun nests without overhead cover would be destroyed. Barbed wire would be blown apart. Mines might be detonated by near misses. And even troops in protected positions, bunkers and caves that could survive the explosions, would be stunned, disoriented, and suppressed by the sheer violence of the barrage. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. Japanese defenders who had endured days of naval bombardment and air attacks knew what to expect from those periods of intense fire, followed by lulls, explosions that came with warning as shells descended or aircraft approached. Violence that was terrible but predictable. The rocket barrage was different. It came suddenly without warning from ships that hadn't been firing moments before. The rockets arrived almost horizontally, screaming in at shallow angles, with distinctive trails of flame and smoke. The explosions weren't individual events that could be counted or predicted, but a continuous roar of detonations that merged into a single, overwhelming assault on the senses. Survivors described it as the most terrifying experience of the war, worse than battleship bombardment, because it was so concentrated and so sustained. For the critical minutes when the barrage was falling, rational thought became impossible. Survival became the only concern, and fighting back was unthinkable. But delivering this apocalyptic firepower required the LSM-R crews to accept risks that were almost suicidal. The effective range of the 5-inch rockets was limited perhaps 3,000 yards maximum, with best results under 2,000 yards. This meant the rocket ships had to move far closer to shore than any other fire support vessel into ranges where Japanese shore batteries, mortars, and even heavy machine guns could engage them effectively. They had to anchor or hold position while firing, making themselves stationary targets. And they had to do this in the final minutes before the landing, when Japanese defenders knew exactly where the assault would come and were concentrating all their remaining firepower on the approaches to the beach. The LSM-R itself had virtually no armor. Its hull was thin steel designed to carry cargo, not to resist gunfire. A single hit from a Japanese field gun could penetrate anywhere on the ship. A mortar round landing on deck could cause devastating casualties among the exposed crew. And the ship was essentially a floating ammunition dump loaded with thousands of rockets, each one containing high explosives and solid rocket fuel. If a Japanese shell hit one of the rocket storage areas, the resulting explosion could destroy the entire ship. The crews knew this. They knew they were sailing explosives-laden targets into point-blank range of enemy guns. They did it anyway because the assault troops depended on them. The operational reality of an LSMR mission was terrifying from start to finish. The ships would accompany the invasion fleet to the target island, usually arriving the day before or the morning of the landing. While battleships and cruisers conducted their bombardment from positions miles offshore, the rocket ships would wait, watching the clock count down to the moment when they would have to move forward. As H-hour approached the designated time, when the first assault wave would hit the beach, the LSM-RS would begin their approach, moving ahead of the landing craft toward positions that had been selected based on charts and reconnaissance, but that might be covered by Japanese guns that had survived the preliminary bombardment. The approach itself was the first moment of maximum danger. Japanese observers on shore could see these strange ships moving forward, could see that they were different from the normal landing craft, and could recognize them as high-value targets worth engaging. Shore batteries that had remained silent during the battleship bombardment, hiding to preserve themselves, might open fire on the rocket ships because they were close enough to hit, and because destroying them would eliminate a major threat to the beach defenses. LSM-R crews would be at battle stations knowing that at any moment, shells might start landing around them, that near misses might disable their steering or engines, that direct hits might kill everyone on deck or detonate their rockets. Once in position, typically between 1,000 and 2,000 yards from shore, close enough to see individual buildings or fortifications, if the smoke from earlier bombardments allowed, the LSMR would anchor or hold station against wind and current. The ship's few defensive weapons, typically 40mm anti-aircraft guns, and perhaps a 5-inch deck gun, would be manned and ready, though they were hopelessly inadequate against shore batteries. Then at a precisely calculated moment, determined by the timing of the assault waves, the rocket barrage would begin. The automatic launchers would start firing, each one rippling through its load of rockets in rapid sequence, the launchers traversing slightly between salvos to spread the fire across the target area. The noise was indescribable, a continuous roar of rocket motors igniting, the whoosh of rockets leaving the rails, the rattle of the automatic loading mechanisms. All of this happening on a small ship where crew members not directly involved in firing had nowhere to go to escape the sound and blast. The rockets themselves created an awesome visual spectacle. Each one left a trail of fire and smoke as it screamed toward shore, and with multiple launchers firing simultaneously, the sky between ship and shore would be filled with dozens of rocket trails at any moment. The impacts on the beach would begin almost immediately. The rockets covered the distance in seconds, and within moments, the entire landing zone would disappear behind a curtain of smoke and explosions. The crews couldn't see what they were hitting. They couldn't adjust their fire based on results. They simply fired according to their plan, launching rocket after rocket into the smoke and trusting that the sheer volume of explosives landing on target was accomplishing its mission. And through all of this, the Japanese were shooting back. Shore batteries that revealed themselves by firing at the rocket ships would immediately be engaged by destroyers and cruisers positioned to provide cover, but it took time to locate and destroy shore positions. And in that time, the LSMR was absorbing fire. Shells would land in the water around the ship, sending up geysers of water that soaked the deck and the crew. Near misses might cause damage from fragments or shock. Direct hits were catastrophic. LSMR crews accepted casualties as inevitable. Men were killed manning the rocket launchers, loading rockets, or simply standing on deck. Ships were damaged and sometimes sank. At Okinawa, which saw extensive use of rocket ships, several LSM-RS were sunk by surefire kamikazes or floating mines, and many more were damaged. The role of the LSM-R in the fire support sequence was carefully choreographed, but extremely demanding. The sequence typically worked like this. Days before the landing, battleships and heavy cruisers would begin systematic bombardment of the island, destroying major fortifications and infrastructure. On the morning of the landing, this bombardment would intensify, with aircraft joining in to strike targets throughout the island. As H-hour approached, destroyers would move closer to shore, engaging specific targets with their 5-inch guns. Then in the final 30 minutes before the first wave landed, the LSM-RS would move into position and begin their barrage. The timing was critical. The The rockets had to suppress beach defenses without hitting the landing craft that were approaching shore, which meant calculating exactly when to start and stop firing based on the speed of the landing craft and the distance they had to travel. At exactly the right moment, usually when the first wave of landing craft was still several hundred yards from shore, but committed to their final approach, the rocket barrage would lift. The LSM RS would cease fire, having expended most or all of their rockets. The landing craft would continue their run to the beach, hitting the sand moments after the rocket fire stopped, hopefully, before Japanese defenders could recover from the barrage and man their weapons. Behind the first wave, the LSM RS would remain on station ready to fire again if needed, though with most of their rockets expended, they could only provide limited support. Usually they would withdraw once the first waves were ashore, returning to the transport area to reload or to provide anti-aircraft defense for the fleet. The effectiveness of rocket barrages was difficult to measure precisely, but was considered essential by those who experienced them. Japanese defenders reported that the rocket attacks were the most terrifying part of the preliminary bombardment, more psychologically devastating than battleship shells or air attacks. American assault troops consistently credited the rocket ships with suppressing beach defenses in the critical first minutes of the landing. While it was impossible to determine exactly how many Japanese troops or weapons were destroyed by the rockets versus other fires, the combination of physical destruction and psychological shock clearly reduced the effectiveness of Japanese beach defenses. Landing beaches that were saturated with rocket fire typically saw lighter initial resistance than those where rocket support was limited or absent. The LSMR also had a secondary mission that was equally dangerous but less well-known: radar picket duty. At Okinawa, where Japanese kamikaze attacks threatened the invasion fleet for months, LSMRs were assigned to picket stations far from the main fleet, positioned to provide early warning of incoming air attacks. This put them in an impossible position stationed alone, or in small groups far from the fleet's concentrated anti-aircraft defenses. They were obvious targets for kamikazes looking for easy kills. The LSMRs on picket duty were essentially sacrificial, positioned to draw attacks and to shoot down as many attackers as possible before being destroyed themselves. Several were sunk by kamikazes, their crews fighting until their ships went down, buying time for the main fleet to prepare for attacks. The men who served on LSM-RS were a unique breed. They had volunteered for or been assigned to what was clearly one of the Navy's most dangerous duties, serving on ships that were too small to be prestigious, too specialized to be versatile, and too vulnerable to offer much hope of survival if things went wrong. They lived in cramped conditions on ships that lacked the amenities of larger vessels, slept next to tons of high explosives, and knew that their combat missions would put them closer to enemy-held shores than any other warship except the landing craft themselves. The casualty rates reflected this reality. LSMR crews suffered disproportionately high losses compared to most naval personnel, with multiple ships sunk and many more damaged across the Okinawa campaign alone. Yet there was pride in serving on these unlikely warships. The crews knew they were doing something essential, providing fire support that no other vessel could deliver, making the difference between successful landings and catastrophic casualties among the assault troops. The spectacle of their own ship launching 1,000 rockets was something that never got old, a moment of raw destructive power that was visible proof of what they were contributing to victory. And there was a kind of defiant humor in serving on ships that looked ungainly and unheroic, but that packed more firepower per ton than almost anything in the fleet. The LSMR concept represented a broader truth about World War II naval warfare that's often overlooked. The most important ships weren't always the most prestigious ones. Battleships and carriers got the headlines and the glory, but amphibious operations depended on hundreds of specialized vessels, each one designed for a specific mission that might seem minor, but that was essential to success. The LSMR was never going to win a fleet engagement or hunt submarines or project power across oceans. It existed to spend 10 minutes pouring rockets onto a beach, and for the Marines and soldiers who depended on that barrage to suppress Japanese defenses, those 10 minutes were the most important part of the entire invasion. The legacy of the LSMR is visible in modern naval doctrine, even though the ships themselves are long gone. The concept of saturation fire support in the final minutes before an assault, the idea that volume of fire matters more than precision in certain tactical situations, the recognition that specialized vessels accepting high risks can enable operations that would otherwise be impossible. All of these remain part of how modern amphibious operations are planned and executed. The rockets themselves evolved into more sophisticated guided weapons, but the basic mission deliver overwhelming firepower close to shore in support of amphibious forces remains unchanged. When the war ended, the LSM-RS were quickly retired. They were too specialized for peacetime service, too vulnerable for modern warfare, and too expensive to maintain for missions that weren't needed anymore. Most were scrapped or sold for commercial conversion. The crews dispersed, returning to civilian life, with memories of serving on the Navy's strangest warships, and with the knowledge that they'd done something few others could claim. They'd taken 1,000-ton ammunition barges into point-blank range of enemy guns, and turned beaches into hellscapes of fire and explosions, so that other men could come ashore and fight. They were the rocket barge sailors, the crews of the LSMR, and for a few brief years in the Pacific, they were essential to every major landing, the tiny ships that fired 1,000 rockets and made amphibious warfare possible against fanatically defended shores.